Hi guys, welcome to today's episode of The Still of the Night, where we explore the darkest corners of true crime and the unexplained. I'm your host, Gemma, and tonight's episode is both heart-wrenching and incredibly disturbing. So I wanted to offer a little warning before we get into this case. We are going to be talking about descriptions of extreme violence and domestic abuse. This is covering the murder of a young woman, so listener discretion is very much advised. This is the story of Kelly Ann Bates, a vibrant, caring and beautiful 17-year-old girl from Manchester, England, whose life was stolen in the most brutal of ways. This isn't just a story of crime. It's a story of manipulation, of control, of hidden horror behind closed doors, and ultimately, it's a story that compels us to ask, how can we better protect the vulnerable? Kelly Ann Bates was born on the 18th of May 1978 in Hattersley, Manchester. She lived with her parents, Tommy and Margaret, and her two brothers. Kelly Ann came from a very close, tight-knit family. She was very much loved and wanted by her parents. When she was born 2 weeks early. She was a really great baby and she grew up to be a bubbly, confident girl. She was sporty and outgoing, and she was particularly good at hockey. In fact, she tried out for a local hockey team and she managed to gain a place as the goalkeeper. And the strange thing about this was that the rest of the people on the team were all older women. But this didn't faze Kelly Ann at all. In fact, she was very, very comfortable being around people older than herself. She was described as very mature and as being older than her years. She was a good student. She was really the perfect daughter, everything that her parents had wanted her to be. Her mum described how she wasn't that confident herself as a teenager, so she really wanted to instill in Kelly Ann this confidence and this independence so that she could go out and take on the world. And everything seemed to be going well until Kelly Ann was about 14 years of age. In 1992, Kelly met Dave Smith while she was babysitting for a family on a neighbouring estate. Dave was friends with the family and offered to walk Kelly home after. Kelly continued seeing Dave secretly after this. And it would be a really long time before Kelly Ann's parents actually met Dave, which is important when we see how this relationship progressed. So there was a lot of secrecy at the beginning, which I'm sure, if you're watching this, you've probably been a teenager. There's something intoxicating about those first flushes of a relationship. And you add this secrecy to it, like it's just the two of you that knows what's going on. It must have felt incredibly exciting to Kelly Ann. The first that Tommy and Margaret knew about this Dave was when Kelly would casually start mentioning his name, not all the time, just kind of dropping it in, and they just assumed that he was a boy, probably from her school, probably around a similar sort of age to Kelly. But they couldn't have been more wrong. When she was 15, Kelly's attitude began to change. She went from being a happy teen who did well in school and was no trouble at home to staying out later at night. Sometimes she would go missing for days at a time without a word to her family. Now, we know that it's normal for teenagers to start pressing boundaries and, they're wanting to do more and sometimes desperate to become adults. But this went far beyond that. At that point, Kelly Ann is like 15, coming up to 16, and her parents still hadn't met this elusive Dave. Well, not face to face anyway. Margaret had actually spoken to him on the phone. Now, initially, when Kelly started staying out, her parents thought that maybe Dave was the bad influence. But when he started calling their house, expressing his own concerns over Kelly's behaviour, Margaret was convinced that actually he wasn't the problem and he wanted to help. And how nice of this young man to be, showing his concern. Now, these phone calls started about 3 months before Kellyanne's parents met Dave face to face. With Kellyanne's behaviour and her only being 15 at this point, the friction between Kellyanne and her parents was really starting to take its toll. Her parents must have been worried out of their minds with her behaviour. They'd gone from having this wonderful daughter who was no trouble to suddenly they're having to ring around her friends to try and find out where she is, or they're having to go to the police to say, can you help us find her? But when Kellyanne turned 16, she finally brought Dave Smith round to meet her parents. Tommy and Margaret walked through their front door and saw a fully grown man walking down the stairs. A man who was very obviously much older than their daughter. And it was at this time that Kelly and Dave admitted that Dave was in fact 32 years old. Up until that point, Dave had very likely been encouraging Kellyanne to lie about his age. He would know that, people are going to have a problem with a grown man sniffing around a 14-year-old. Although, we're talking about 1992. So we weren't talking about grooming and what have you now. He probably just would have been seen as a bit of a pervert. But we start to see those first flushes of control, of him manipulating her, of him, getting her to lie for him. And Margaret said that the first time she saw him, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She said that she sensed that he wasn't a great man. She said, quote, "He was much older than I expected, and this wasn't the man I wanted for my daughter. I vividly recall seeing our bread knife in the kitchen and wanting to pick it up and stab him in the back. It was a bizarre thought. I would never normally think anything so violent, and now I wonder if it was some sort of sixth sense. I've thought about that many times," end quote. So Margaret was livid at first, but Kelly seemed happy and was adamant that she wanted to be in this relationship with Dave. And remember, at this point, she's 16. She's gearing up to leave school because back then we were able to leave school, and that's what we wanted to do at 16. So she's gearing up, she's getting ready for her adult life. Though not happy, her parents allowed her to continue seeing them. And I know that some of you are going to be listening and thinking, absolutely not. If my 16-year-old came home with a 32-year-old, there is no way, absolutely no chance that I would allow that to continue. But what we have to remember here is that Kellyanne had already started running away, going off and disappearing. The last thing you want to do is to go in too harshly in a situation like that and push her further away and end up where she leaves and she doesn't come back and you don't know where she is and what's happening. So I guess they probably really were in between a rock and a hard place with this one. And Kelly and Dave had already been seeing each other for, at least 18 months at this point. Kellyanne's already emotionally bonded with this man. And let me say, as someone who is not that much younger than Kellyanne, I was born in the 80s. I was probably raised in an environment, in a neighborhood that was pretty similar to Kellyanne's neighborhood. And when I tell you, it was not unusual for young girls to be preyed upon by old men. I know several girls who had relationships with much, much older men. None of them worked out. They all had these similar problems. Not to this extent that we're going to see in Kellyanne's relationship. But yeah, it was frowned upon, but it most definitely happened. And all of the girls that I know that were in relationships with older men all did it very secretly. They weren't running around telling their parents what was going on. So after meeting Dave and, not being happy about it, Margaret started asking around in the town if anyone knew him so that she could try and get some understanding of who he really was, because she didn't know anything about him. But no one knew anything about Dave Smith. This, 32-year-old Dave Smith who's dating 16-year-old Kellyanne, and he's been sniffing around her since he was 14. Nobody knows who he is. That's because Dave Smith wasn't actually called Dave Smith. His real name was James Patterson Smith, and everyone referred to him as Jimmy. And Jimmy wasn't 32. Jimmy was 48, which means he'd have been about 45 when he first started grooming Kellyanne. Now, everything about this guy just makes my skin crawl. Smith's attempts to control and manipulate Kellyanne were already in full effect. He wanted to know where she was at all times. And as we go through this, you'll see just how manipulative he was, how he tried to play the nice guy. So Kellyanne would go to his house all weekend. He would walk her to the bus stop on Sunday for her to go home again. Then while she was on the bus, he would go home and call Margaret to let her know that Kellyanne was on the bus, which on the surface could be seen as kindness. He's letting Margaret know that Kelly was on her way home. She's safe. Don't worry, she'll be back soon. But the second Kellyanne walked through the door, the phone would go again, and it was, of course, Smith, checking that Kelly was home. Now, he probably tried to use a pretense that he was worried about her safety, but knowing how their relationship progressed, it's likely he just wanted to check that she had gone straight home. He was a jealous man. He had clearly timed how long it took her to get from her bus stop, the exact time that the bus got to the bus stop, then how long it took her to walk home to know the second that she walked through the door. And if she was late, he's going to be wanting to know why. You know, where did you go? Who did you speak to? You know, have you stopped to talk to anybody? Did you go anywhere else? He's going to want to know all of this. Tale as old as time, it's control disguised as, you know, I'm protective. But if Kellyanne had appeared to be happy when she first introduced Smith to her family, she wasn't by this point. She'd stopped taking care of herself. Her hair was unwashed and greasy. She wore baggy, dark clothing and always appeared to have her head down to her chest. She'd just gone through this complete transformation from this bright, bubbly girl that she'd been just 2 years before. And I just think, as her parents, that must have been devastating to see. Arguments in the family home were still a regular occurrence between Kellyanne and her mum. Kellyanne was still going disappearing for days on end, and this was a real stressor for her parents. One argument led to Margaret trying to put down firmer boundaries with Kelly, with kind of a my house, my rules kind of speech. You know, if you don't like it, don't come back. So when Kellyanne spent another night out of the house without telling her parents, she came home the following day and started packing her bags. When Margaret walked in and saw Kelly, she tried to reason with her. She said that she hadn't meant that Kelly had to leave and, you know, can they sit down and sort things out? That when she said, you know, you have to leave, it was out of pure frustration, not because she genuinely wanted her to leave. That was when Kellyanne turned around and one half of her face was completely black with bruises. Margaret accused Smith of hitting her, but Kellyanne denied it. She claimed to have been jumped by a group of girls. She then said that she'd passed out and a random couple had taken her back to their house, and that's where she'd been. Now, this story obviously doesn't make sense, you know, to anybody listening to this. You're probably going to be thinking, well, if you were attacked, surely this random couple would take you to hospital, or they'd take you home, or they'd, you know, get the police involved. Why would they take you back to their house? And, you know, Margaret thought the same thing. She didn't believe that. But there wasn't really a lot that she could do while Kellyanne was still denying any domestic violence. But the violence in their relationship just continued to escalate. On the 30th of November 1995, Kellyanne moved into Smith's 2-bedroom semi-detached house in Furnival Road, Gorton. She was just 17. Smith and Kellyanne only lived together for 5 months, but during that time he subjected her to increasing levels of abuse. Anytime Kellyanne went to visit her parents, she had fresh bruises and marks on her, including fingertip bruising to her arms and her neck. One time, she even had a bite mark on her hand that she'd played off as an accident. She said that she'd been out and she tripped over and that she'd brushed her hand on the fence. But to anybody else looking, it was clearly teeth marks. Her parents had begged her to leave Smith, and she did leave him once briefly, but as is a pattern that we see so many times in domestic violence relationships, at this point she is so manipulated by him. He knows exactly what to say to win her around. I won't do it again. I'm so sorry. I love you. Please don't leave me. And she decided to go back to him. A lot of things that I saw online with this case when I was researching were people saying, why didn't the parents do more? If it was me and it was my child, I would have, dragged them out. I would have locked them in their room. I would have stopped this relationship. And I think that they were just in a really, really difficult place. They're between the proverbial rock and a hard place. If they push too hard, she runs away and she goes to him. They know at this point that there is physical violence in that relationship. So I think that they were just trying to keep the channels of communication open so that Kellyanne eventually would see what he was like and that she would know that they were there for her and that she always had a place to go to. They did ask for help from outside agencies as well. They asked for help from the police and from social services, but because Kellyanne was over the age of 16, there was nothing that anyone could or would do. Margaret was told to make an appointment at the doctor's with Kelly's GP under Kelly's name, but to attend herself and to explain the concerns that she had, so that if Kellyanne went to seek medical attention, that there would be a record of this suspected domestic abuse. I hadn't heard of this before, but I thought that was such a great tip if you were concerned, about a loved one, just to get it on record somewhere so that if she needed help, they would be able to, give her the right sort of support that she needed. By December of 1995, Kellyanne had quit her part-time admin job, which meant that she was even more isolated in Smith's home. Her visits to her parents grew less frequent, and when she did speak with her parents on the phone, it always sounded as if she was being careful about what she was saying, as if, Smith was watching or is listening. So even if she wanted to talk about what was really happening, she was never going to have an opportunity. How scared she must have been of him. If you know anything about domestic violence relationships, you know that it doesn't take anything tangible to set these people off. So you can see that he's watching what she's saying. He's checking that she's staying in line, and there would have been consequences for her if she'd have not done what she was told. Finally, during a phone call with her mum, Kellyanne said that she'd got a new job in a factory and she'd be working the 2 till 10 p.m. shift, which meant that she wouldn't be able to see them as much. And on the surface, that seems reasonable, right? If you are working that kind of shift, most people are at work before you start work, and then you're at work all evening until 10 o'clock. You're not back till whatever time. You probably want to sleep in a little bit in the morning. So it makes sense as to why you wouldn't see people as regularly. And I have to assume that this came from Smith, that he thought this up as a way that they're not just going to pop round of an evening to see Kellyanne, her parents or, her family are not, because they're going to assume that she's not there. The last phone call that Kellyanne made to her mom was on the 10th of March 1996. Just 1 month later, Kellyanne would be dead. In the month before Kellyanne was killed, 3 cards were sent to her parents' house. 1 for her dad's birthday, 1 for her parents' wedding anniversary, and 1 for Mother's Day. All of the cards were signed from Kelly, but were very clearly written in Smith's handwriting. As the family realised that they were being restricted access to Kelly, her brother actually went round to Furnivall Road, only to be told that she was out. Neighbours were also concerned about Kellyanne and knocked on the door to ask if they could see her. Smith made Kellyanne stand in the bedroom window so that they could see her, but he didn't allow her to come to the front door. That, you hear that and you think that would be so worrying if you were concerned about a neighbour so much so that you'd gone round. And that's what he did. He made her stand in the window. But also, I can understand why they didn't follow up with anything, because like I say, I grew up in an environment similar to this, and it was not unusual to hear neighbours screaming and shouting and having arguments. It wasn't even unusual to see people, heterosexual couples getting into full-on fistfights outside of a pub. If you go to the pub with your family for a quick drink, or a drink or a disco or something at the working men's club on a Saturday evening, to see people having full-on fistfights, and nobody got involved because it was like, oh, it's just a domestic. They'll be fine again in the morning, so just don't get involved. But it does make you question what exactly the neighbours heard. But the torture that Kellyanne was subjected to by Smith in the weeks following are some of the most disturbing I've ever read about in my life. And I am going to be going into some detail about what happened. So I'll tell you when we're going to really go into it, so you can skip ahead if you don't want to listen to that. But on the 16th of April 1996, Smith walked into his local police station to report the accidental death of his girlfriend after an argument. He claimed he'd tried and failed to resuscitate Kellyanne. So the police rushed to his address to find Kellyanne naked on the bedroom floor and covered in a blanket. It was very obvious that Kellyanne had not died accidentally. So immediately, Smith was arrested for murder. If you don't already loathe this man, then you definitely will after this. Kellyanne's post-mortem established her cause of death was drowning, but she had over 150 injury sites on her body. Kelly had been held prisoner for weeks and subjected to horrific torture. I'm going to list off some of the injuries that Kelly sustained during those last few weeks. So if you don't want to hear that, skip ahead a minute or two now and kind of rejoin me afterwards. Kellyanne had been tied to radiators and chairs by her hair. She also had ligature marks around her neck. Smith had withheld food and, at least for the last few days, water as well. And when she died, she was only 6 stone. She had scalding to her buttocks and left leg, burn marks on her thighs that he'd made from pressing a hot iron against her bare skin. She had fractured arms, multiple stab wounds from kitchen knives, forks and scissors, stab wounds inside her mouth, crush injuries to both of her hands. He had smashed both of her kneecaps, presumably to immobilize her. There was mutilation to her ears, nose, eyebrows, mouth and genitalia. Wounds caused by a garden spade and pruning shears. She'd been partially scalped. Both of her eyes had been gouged out by Smith, likely with his own bare hands. There was also evidence of stab wounds inside of her eye sockets. So he'd gouged her eyes out and then stabbed in the sockets. All of these injuries were at different stages of healing. So this was not just a one-off, loss of control moment. This was prolonged. This was just sustained sadistic torture. Her post-mortem showed that her eyes were gouged out at least 5 days before she died, but it could have been up to 3 weeks. So for a minimum of 5 days, she had to live with her eyes gouged out. It's so incredibly unbelievable that somebody could inflict this level of pain on someone. He is a monster. This is evil. There's no other word for someone to do, for someone who does this. He literally took everything away from her. He took her eyesight. He took her mobility. I'm assuming, was thinking that if he falls asleep, he needs to know that she's not going to be able to escape. So let me smash her kneecaps so she can't move. And then, in the small chance that she was able to move and drag herself out of that house, let me take her eyesight so she can't see where she's going. So she's going to have to make noise if she can move to get out. And it's just, he did everything to stop her from being able to leave. I can't even begin to imagine what Kellyanne suffered. She's 17, it's just horrendous. Finally, he dragged her into the bathroom where he beat her with the shower head and held her underwater in the bath. The Home Office pathologist William Lawler said that Kellyanne's injuries were, quote, the worst he'd seen on a murder victim, end quote. This happened a lot with people that were involved, from the police all the way up to the prosecutor and the judge in his trial, talking about the injuries that they'd seen just being the worst. And these are people whose job it is to deal with very violent crimes. During the police investigation, Kellyanne's blood was found in every room of that house. Smith's trial began on the 12th of November 1997 at Manchester Crown Court. He denied murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Now, not only did he say it wasn't his fault, he actively tried to say it was Kellyanne's fault. She'd been driving him mad with all of her lies and arguments, that she would taunt him about his dead mother. He even claimed that Kellyanne would ask him or challenge him to hurt her. That out of spite, if he did anything to her, like if he reacted to something that she'd done, because of course it's all her fault, it's not him, that she would then hurt herself more to make him look bad. Like, really? He also claimed that Kellyanne often pretended to be unconscious. That when she was in the bath, he thought that she was playing at being unconscious. I can't with this guy. Now, obviously, Smith wasn't betting on any of his previous partners being called to give evidence in his trial. And you're probably thinking, this guy was 45 when he met Kellyanne. There's no way this is the first relationship that he's been in, that he has actively abused people. And you'd be right to think that this was not the first relationship. It was through these other witnesses coming forward, the evidence that they were able to provide about their relationships with him, that showed Kellyanne's family just what kind of man their daughter had been living with. Let's go back over his relationship history then. In 1980, Smith's 10-year marriage came to an end because of his domestic violence towards his ex-wife. Soon after that, Smith started a 2-year relationship with 20-year-old Tina Watson. What you're going to notice is a pattern of him getting older and his victims getting younger. Tina described their relationship as abusive. She said how Smith would slap, kick, and punch her, and it started as kind of every now and again, and by the end, it was every single day. He once hit her over the head with an ashtray. She said he would use her as a punching bag when she was pregnant with their child. She described his fits of sudden rage, of how she'd be in the bath, and then he would just storm in and try and push her head down under the water. again, you're going to see patterns in these relationships. Now, as that relationship broke down, Smith turned his attention to 15-year-old Wendy Mottershead. So we're now in about 1982. And she described a similar experience to the others. Regular beatings, obsessive jealousy, fits of rage, and, like I say, as was his pattern, attempted drownings. While arguing in the kitchen, Smith had attempted to hold Wendy's head down in the kitchen sink. All of these women talked of, his crazy jealousy, of how he would stalk them if they tried to get away or even hold them captive. During the trial, a psychologist, Dr. Gillian Measy, testified Smith suffered from, quote, a severe paranoid disorder with morbid jealousy, end quote, and lived in a distorted reality. Prosecuting this case, Peter Openshaw told the jury, quote, it was as if he deliberately disfigured her, causing her the utmost pain, distress, and degradation. The injuries were not the result of one sudden eruption of violence. They must have been caused over a long period and were so extensive and so terrible that the defendant must have deliberately and systematically tortured the girl, end quote. So as much as Smith thought that he was going to manipulate the jury into thinking that he was the victim, it took the jurors just 1 hour to find him guilty of murdering Kelly Ann Bates. He was sentenced to life with a minimum of 20 years. When sentencing, the judge, Mr. Justice Sachs, said, quote, this has been a terrible case, a catalogue of depravity by one human being upon another. You are a highly dangerous person. You are an abuser of women, and I intend, so far as it is in my power, that you will abuse no more, end quote. I don't think his sentence was anywhere near long enough. But again, we have to remember that this was back in the 1990s. Judges at this point did not have the power to give out whole life tariffs. At that point, it was only the Home Secretary who had that discretion. And it wasn't until 2003 that judges were given the power to impose whole life orders, but only in a very narrow set of circumstances or a set criteria. I believe one of the criteria is it has to be murder, and it has to be 2 people murdered, or 2 or more people. So even if the judge had the power to do that, if this case had been tried just a few years later, it's likely that Smith wouldn't have been eligible for it in the first place. Now, when I was reading up about whole life orders, I found something on the government website, but it was from 2023, and it seemed as if Rishi Sunak's government were attempting to expand the use of whole life orders. So they wanted that in cases of murder, where the murder was so extreme, that a whole life order would be a starting point. It would be the defendant would have to show exceptional circumstances to kind of deviate away from that, to get a sentence of life with a minimum term. Because obviously whole life orders, you're not ever getting out. You don't get the chance to go on parole. You've messed up so badly, you've caused so much harm. That's it, you're done. And I actually think that they should be used more, but that's just me. But they were also attempting to allow judges to use whole life orders if there was a single victim, if there was an element of, I think it said sexual or sadistic behavior. In this case, I think, we've covered the sadistic element in this case. Not sure whether the Sentencing Act ever got changed. So if you have more knowledge on that, please do let me know. I saw that it went through the first 2 readings in the House of Commons, but I couldn't find information as to what happened with it after that. And obviously now we have a different government. So, but men like this shouldn't ever have the option of coming back into society. This case was so traumatizing that for the first time at Manchester Crown Court, all jury members were offered counselling, and every single one of them accepted. I mean, they must have seen some just really, really disturbing stuff. The thing about abusers is that they very often hide in plain sight, that they rely on your silence and not speaking up. You have to ask the question, how did this man get away with abusing so many women? And it's extreme, it's really extreme. It gets more extreme with each relationship. But those that knew him described him as house proud and a teetotaler. He's not out in the street openly abusing people. He's hiding behind this facade of a normal guy. And his previous abuse never resulted in a conviction. I don't know whether his previous partners didn't go to the police, or if they did and nothing was done. There is, this is not about victim blaming at all. If those women did not go to the police, I can completely understand why. Can you imagine, you're being abused every single day. You finally get away. You're not going to want to prolong any contact with him. And especially back in the 90s, coercive control wasn't a thing. That wasn't enacted into law until 2015. We weren't talking about grooming or, domestic violence was very much just if it was physical violence. And even then, if you didn't speak up at the time it happened, the chances are you weren't going to be believed, or it's like, okay, whatever, just leave them then. We know statistically, now that women are most at risk and most vulnerable when they are just about to leave a violent relationship or just after. His previous partners were probably just grateful to be away from him and probably just wanted to heal and move on with their lives. But it's shocking, though, that he had no criminal record at all at the time of Kelly's murder. Murder was the first charge on his record. Kellyanne's funeral was held on Friday, the 17th of May, 1996, the day before her 18th birthday. And the whole community came out to pay their respects, and it was standing room only in the church. She was laid to rest in Mottram Cemetery, which, having seen the pictures, is really beautiful. It's so peaceful. It overlooks the moors. It's completely surrounded by nature. And if anybody deserves to spend eternity in a peaceful place, it's Kellyanne. In an interview that I saw with Kellyanne's mum, Margaret, she vowed to be waiting for Smith if and when he ever got released from prison. Now, sadly, Margaret passed away in 2020. And in November of 2022, Smith went before the parole board. He was 74 years old. The 3-person panel decided that Smith was still too dangerous, and he, thankfully, was denied parole. Interestingly, he was also refused being moved to an open prison. Now, I for one hope that that man never sees freedom again in his life. But I did think it was very interesting that they refused to move him to an open prison. If they'd have denied parole, but then moved him to an open prison, I would have assumed that they were kind of gearing up to maybe releasing him at some point in the future. But the fact that they've said no to everything suggests that they have no plans to let him out. And that's how it should be. So he's in his mid-70s now. So let's hope he's not got much time left. Kellyanne's story is such a powerful one. It's a vital lesson about the signs of grooming, the tactics that these abusers use, and the power of coercive control. And like I said, today, coercive control is recognised as a criminal offence, but it wasn't back then. And, that's an important step, that we recognise all of these things now, but we still need much more. We still need to go further. We need more resources, and we need more conversations about interpersonal violence, about these very young girls who are preyed upon by these older abusive men. So if you're listening to this and you or someone that you love is in a controlling or an abusive relationship, please, please reach out for help. Help is available. There are organisations, helplines, people that can listen, people that will listen without judgment, without blame, that can help you to leave or to help your loved one leave. I will link some information. If you're watching on YouTube, it will be in the description box. If you're listening to this, I'll put it in the show notes. These relationships will not get better. Things will not change. He's not just having a bad day. This is not a one-off. It will get worse and worse. So please reach out for help. So Kellyanne should be 47 years old today. Maybe she would have been a teacher like she always dreamed of. Perhaps she'd be a mum with her own children. Perhaps she'd be living a peaceful life. But her story, as painful as it is, and it's really hard to hear what she went through, must be told. Not just to honour her memory, but to protect others as well. Because it's the silence that abusers are relying on, and it's that silence where they thrive. If you are able to, please consider sharing this episode. Every download, every listen helps us to reach more people and shine a light on stories that deserve to be heard. Thank you so much, guys, for joining me. My name is Gemma. This was The Still of the Night, and I will see you guys in the next episode. And until then, stay safe.